I'm so grateful to be present with you this morning and to bring you this Easter message, which is certainly one of the most unique Easter experiences I've had. You know, doing pastoring and leading a spiritual community, 15 years in Oregon, and now more than halfway through my first year here in Atlanta. Christmas and Easter the messages tend to get a little bit the same, right? But this year presented some unique opportunities to do something wholly wonderful and unique, a holy shift with the message. So I just invite you to open your ears, open your hearts, take a breath with me as we tune in to what I know Spirit will do in, through, and as me. I'll try to stick to my notes as much as possible. Last week we looked at the many layers of the story, the layers of story that are the beginning, the middle, and an end. Right? Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we looked at Palm Sunday as a example of that, and the many layers of Passover and how the tradition it came to be. And when Jesus actually moved into Jerusalem, there was a Passover celebration happening, and all of those sorts of things. And we talked about where we are today, that we're at the beginning of what feels like a very dark chapter with the death toll rising and the things that we're going through in this pandemic experience. We're in the middle of a transformation, a holy shift, a transformation of our society and our ways of being together. And we're at the end of an old story, a story that no longer serves us and no longer serves humanity, and hasn't for a very long time, right? Which is how we got to where we are. And so today I want to look a little bit deeper as we turn our attention to the lessons that we can learn from the examples in the ministry of Jesus and the many layers that are written about him. My take on Jesus is very simple. Jesus represented in personhood what is possible for all of us in principle. Jesus represented in personhood what is possible for all of us in principle. That's my answer when somebody says, well, what's your relationship? What's your take? What's the New Thought take on Jesus? That's what I say. So Palm Sunday points us to a series of critical moments in the life of Jesus in which we can unpack and begin to see the critical elements of spiritual awakening, both for the individual and collectively for society. And there are several to choose from as we move now into the Easter experience. And the one I want to focus on today is leading into Easter is still part of that Holy Week or that Passover experience, the Last Supper, the Passover meal, where he takes his disciples. He knows what's happening. He knows that the authorities are after him. He knows the inevitable end of his life as he continues to be bold about his message and his conviction. We'll talk about that conviction in a moment. And so he gathers his disciples and says, let's have one last meal. Let's celebrate this Passover together. And as I mentioned last week and in the video promo about today, the Passover meal is very specific, right? There's something bitter in it to represent the past and the pain and the suffering. There's the nuts and mixture. I forget what it's called in the Hebrew word, but it's a pasty mixture that kind of represents the mortar, the brick and mortar from when they were enslaved in Egypt, right? And then there's the bread, which is unleavened, of course, because they're on the run from Pharaoh. And Jesus says to his disciples, take this bread, which is in the Passover tradition referred to as the bread of affliction. Take this bread and break it and eat it. What is the affliction that he is asking to be broken? I want to pause there just for a minute and let that rattle around in our consciousness and in our being as we move through the rest of the message today. But what is the affliction that is asking to be broken in the Easter experience? Easter is a moment in consciousness. It is not something that happens 3 days after. We'll unpackage this in a little bit, but the 3 days after is a element of storytelling that was that was used by many different stories, right? So it's a signature. It's like a time signature that tells you that this story is important for a reason. It has nothing to do with what actually historically happened. So Easter is a moment in the mind. It's a moment in consciousness. It happened long after the 3 days after Jesus' death. So let's unpackage this a little bit and see if we can get to that Easter moment in consciousness, since we're all here celebrating Easter together. There are many layers when we look at biblical stories. There's the story itself, there's the history and the cultural context, and then there's the conscious insight. And I'm always trying to get to the conscious insight. But to get to the conscious insight with the metaphysical principle, we've got to look at the history, the story itself, the history, and then the cultural context. The story, I'm sure you're all familiar with. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that today. But the history behind it, the history or the cultural context that sets this in place is that during Holy Week, there is a tremendous upheaval of social tension that's been going on for a long time throughout Jesus' life. Social tensions, political corruption, Roman occupation of the city of Jerusalem, who the Roman rule has a complete dissatisfaction and intolerance for anyone who is not like them. There is a coexistence between the Roman ruling class and the Jewish people, so long as the Jewish people follow their rules. And so there's a symbiotic sense of homeostasis that tries to get created, but it gets created through political corruption. The religious leaders colluding with the state authorities to try to create peace. But the truth is, underneath that, there's tremendous tension and injustice taking place. The cultural context is for today that we experience is that, in the history to understand, is that the Apostle Paul has a whole lot more to do with Christianity than Jesus ever did, right? Jesus is a Hebrew a scholar, a rabbi, a rabbinical teacher, and social justice advocate for his time. And the followers of the way knew the man and his message, which was a radical message. But Paul doesn't know the man. Paul has an experience in consciousness, an encounter with the cosmic Christ, a universal principle, right? And what happens to a cosmic experience? What happens when you and I have a cosmic insight, but we don't know what to do with it? We don't know how to explain it. Paul does what anybody would do. He puts it in story. He wraps it in a mythos, right? A mythology. And so you and I have the obligation to unpackage the mythology so that we can access the principle, right? In other words, Easter needs a resurrection. It needs a resurrection so we can experience the principle from the myth, away from the myth. So we have this man, Jesus, who is a rabbi, a teacher, and his message is simple. His message is about love. And then we have the cosmic Christ principle, which is a universal principle, which from everything that we know and all the other ways in which this principle has revealed itself throughout history, it is a principle that is about connection or covenant, redemption, and liberation. The liberation of consciousness, the liberation of humanity through its connection with the divine. And these elements of the story, if we go back to Easter for just a moment, the image of a God buried in a tomb, being withdrawn and said to live again, is not new or unique to Jesus or Easter at all. It's thousands of years old, right? It lives in the mythology of Zoroaster and Mithras and Esther, who we take the title and the name Easter from, and Osiris. And of all the resurrected Savior God stories, which there are many, worshipped before and at the beginning of the Christian timeline, none contribute more to the mythology and the development of Easter more than the Egyptian god Osiris. Osiris is called the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the Good Shepherd. He was called the God who made men and women to be born again. He was referred to as the resurrection and the life. He was the God-man who suffered, who died, and who rose again to live eternally in heaven. And those that believed in Osiris were said to share in eternal life with him. Does any of that sound familiar? Right. In the Mithras tradition, there's a rite of passage, which is about a symbolic death and a rebirth. And that being associated with that rebirth meant that you had favor, that favor was shown upon you. So why did Jesus die? Right. The mythos is all wrapped up in this idea that he died for you and I for our sins. Obviously, as a New Thought pastor, I have an issue with that because it does something against the divine quality and nature of our wholeness. But more importantly, when we look at the myth, we see that there's so much attached to that. We need to unpackage it. I believe that Jesus died for about a sin, a collective sin of humanity. And we'll get to that in just a minute. You see, he cared for corporal sin or the sins of the state just as much as he did about individual sin, right? He was a social justice message person. He was talking about the upliftment of humanity through our behavior with and for each other, not just as individuals, but as a collective. But we hear so little about that, the sins of the state. We hear so little about that from those who promote and want you and I to take Jesus as our personal savior. Why is that? Maybe it's because their institutions are complicit in the quest for greed and power, which was something that Jesus experienced from the religious leaders of his day as well. You see, in his stories, you will always find the marriage between personal responsibility and the collective state around us, the society that we're creating. The story of the Good Samaritan is a good example, right? Happens on the Jericho Road, which is a very dangerous place. It's a place of commerce and travel, but it's also a place where a lot of theft and robbery takes place, right? And that story is just as much about personal responsibility as it is about the system that created it. Yes, it's about the person who crosses the road, the Good Samaritan who dares to break the social rules and help someone in need. But the story is also a social political commentary, a critique upon the system that created the injustice in the first place. Systemic issues of poverty, systemic issues of violence, systemic issues of inequity. Why do those conditions exist in the first place? And the rise of a collective sense of indifference to it, everybody else who passes on the road. The collective indifference or numbing to the suffering of the least of these. That's not just a personal message, that's a collective, societal message. Similarly, we find ourselves in this pandemic experience. Let's be honest with ourselves. COVID-19 and the issue that we are facing is yes, about personal responsibility, right? The hashtag stay home, save lives. Many of us have posted that or put that frame on our picture or whatever it might be, right? But it's just as much, this moment that we're in is just as much about systemic inequity. Systemic inequity in our healthcare system in terms of access and coverage. Systemic inequity in economic exploitation of low-wage earners. My friend Bishop William Barber says that this pandemics only can grow and fester and expand along the fissures of society, those places of the open wounds that we have. And we have open wounds in terms of classism and racism, economic injustice and healthcare injustice, and so on and so forth. And now we find ourselves dependent upon those very same low-paying wage earners that we don't want to pay $15 an hour or give adequate healthcare coverage to. our capacity to stay home and shelter in place is dependent on those individuals going to work and putting themselves at risk. Jesus found this notion of sin in terms of being focused on the individual far too simplistic. Right? As a rabbi, he's responsible, as are all rabbis, for teaching the rabbinical law, which is about when to wash your hands and when to eat and when to pray and what to do at sundown and what to do at sunrise, how to behave. It's a whole lot of individual rules, right? But he found this idea of sin or breaking those rules, focus on the individual, be far too simplistic. He knew that there was a societal, systemic issues that needed to be addressed. He reveals this when he says in Matthew, he says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but I came to fulfill." And what he's really saying there in between the lines is, I didn't come to destroy how you are, or I didn't come to destroy the law itself. What I came to destroy or to disrupt or to bring to your attention is the way that you're using the law. Or in other words, the way that you understand sin. You only understand it at the individual level, but there's a collective something. You notice that passage, you notice how awkward it sort of ends. It says, I came to fulfill. In many translations of the Bible, they add to that, and they add it. I came to fulfill it, or I came to fulfill them, referring to the laws. But in the original Greek, those words aren't there. It just says, I came to fulfill. It's kind of an abrupt ending. And the Greek word, which I have no idea how to pronounce, but it's spelled P-L-E-R-O-O, pluru, maybe, pluru. But it's a Greek word for fulfill, and it means to make full, to fill up, to complete, to render something full. And so he says, I didn't come to break the law. I came to render full, to make complete. In other words, there's something missing about the way you're applying the law. There's something missing. So I haven't come to break the law. I've come to fulfill it. I've come to make complete in your understanding, in your collective consciousness and capacity. You're following what I'm saying here, right? There's something missing. There's something different has to be done in order to fulfill the law. And so what is Jesus' message about the law? He talks the most about the law in the Sermon on the Mount. Specifically, he says, you have heard it said, meaning you know the law, you've heard it said about the law that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Anybody, he says, can pray for those you like, but can you pray for everybody? Can you love everybody? In other words, his version of the law is, the fulfillment of the law is to love each other, to love everyone. This is a radical message of social upheaval, to level the playing field and stop playing us and them games, but start playing a game of love and justice and equity through our behavior, both as individuals and as a society. And so he died because he challenged the status quo. He died because he upset the authorities. He died because he would not sit silently while those who had little were persecuted by those who had much. He died because he was a social justice warrior, because he lived and spoke into a system of oppression and discrimination against a ruling class that did not tolerate anyone who was different than them, anyone who was the other and who stepped out of line of the rules that they established. His message was about resurrecting a covenant that had always been in society, in the connection between the human and the divine life. Covenant that we always find. It's there in nature, which is why Easter gets attached to the spring ritual of renewal and rebirth, because the covenant lives inside of us. It's always there, and it comes around every year to remind us. Right? So Jesus lives his life in a way that he says, Samaritan lives matter. Children's lives matter. Gentile lives matter. Jewish lives matter. Women's lives matter. Lepers' lives matter. Healthcare workers' lives matter. Black and brown people's lives matter. Low wage earner lives matter. Grocery clerk lives matter. The covenant is simple. We belong to each other. And the message is clear: to return to love. And speaking into religious institutions, he makes it clear that our faith is not defined by who we discriminate against. Our faith is defined by how much love we have and how inclusive our circle is. Our faith is not defined by a set of moral, ethical standards that we insist everyone obeys. The sin, the affliction that Jesus wanted to break, that he wanted to cleanse the earth of, was separation from God, separation from divinity, as an individual and collectively. The Passover meal is a celebration and a remembrance of the Israelites' journey out of slavery, out of bondage, out of captivity. When he says, take this bread of affliction, break it, eat it, remember me. He's saying, remember, the affliction is broken. The affliction of consciousness, the affliction of slavery, the affliction of oppression that you have imposed upon yourself and that you have allowed to seep into society again through the presence of this ruling class, the Roman Empire, because you have forgotten who you are. You've forgotten your divinity. Do this in remembrance of me. Eat it. Remember me. Become one with me in this quest to wake humanity up. Become one with me in the quest to wake humanity up from the affliction of otherness, from the affliction of us and them, from the affliction of separation from our wholeness. The Easter moment is a moment in consciousness in which the disciples and those that heard of Jesus' message are overwhelmed with the insight of this consciousness. And they can't let it go. They can't let it go. They have to share it. Why? Because he reflected back to them their own wholeness. And suddenly it dawns on them. That wholeness lives in me. And that wholeness lives in you. Elizabeth Lester, author of a book called Broken Open, which is the title of today's message, says this: some people break during difficult times, and some people break open and lead us to better days. We love to idolize those people, the ones who leave breadcrumbs of hope and illumination for us to follow on the path in the dark woods. But we can be those people. These times, our times, are asking this of us. So much is changing so fast, so dramatically. From weather patterns to gender roles, from population overload to communication overwhelm, from the ways we work and the ways we live. No wonder the angst level is high. We can be those people. Something is breaking open right now in the heart of humanity, or seeking to break open. But in order for something to break open, it must first break down. It must first break. And so we are allowing it to break. But we as New Thought people, we as awakened souls, have the opportunity to, in the midst of this moment, become the imaginal cells inside of the chrysalis, to hold the vision of the butterfly state, which is still a far off dream, a structure of being that we can't even comprehend in the midst of this gooey mess that we find ourselves in, where everyone is eating at each other. Society and all the structures are breaking down inside of the chrysalis of the caterpillar. The old is gone. Cannot return to that. We cannot return to that mass consumerism. We cannot return to that structures of knowing that the caterpillar knows. And we can't even really begin to imagine what the next thing is yet. And in the midst of that moment, the imaginal cells come forward. And they hold the vision for what's possible. They literally become the DNA, the visionary DNA of what is to be. And you and I, this is why spiritual community is so important, whether we're connecting virtually or we're connecting in person. Places like Centers for Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta, and many other awakened and illumined places. This is why belonging to something is so important, and why your tithes and contributions are so important to support and sustain this, because together we get to create a place where we get to support each other in learning the tools and the wisdom and the insight, the spiritual principles, and the tools for awakening humanity to its magnificence. It's something we say every week. But did you realize this was the task that you were up for? Did you realize that what you were really being asked to do was to be an imaginal cell in the chrysalis goo of the in-between state of humanity? Did you realize that you were being asked to be a visionary cell of justice, a visionary cell of love and equity, a visionary cell of forgiveness and compassion? You and I hold the visionary DNA of what's possible for humanity, so that in these times it may not just break, but that it may also break open to something bigger, to create and experience a radical and holy shift. It wouldn't be Easter if I didn't quote Rumi. I love Rumi. He says, and I read this as I was standing on my porch this morning, listening to the birds on Easter morning. He says, the breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door still where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door still where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. Let us wake up on this Easter morning. Let us have new eyes and new vision for what is possible. And as we come out of the chrysalis of this moment, let us reshape our world and reform our society and reestablish what it means to be community together. Reestablish what it means to be a people who are for something and against nothing. Reestablish what it means to create equity and justice for all. Ernest Holmes, on an Easter morning, gave a sermon and said this: today the horizon is clear. The voyage starts anew. We are reborn. The true resurrection is not only from this life to the next, but it takes place daily, hourly, as we shed the limited concepts of life and come into the vineyard to gather the fruits of life, the fruits of spirit, hanging rich from the vines of God. A person may be reborn, remade, and renewed in mind and body just through taking a little time to get acquainted with their higher self. Just through coming to recognize the invisible and almost unknown guest who accompanies everyone through life, the spiritual presence within. We should resurrect ourselves through the joy and the simplicity and the spontaneity of life, leaving the corpse of our dead yesterdays in the tombs of their own obscurity. We should live more abundantly in God this day. And when we come out of the tomb of ignorance and disbelief, how glorious shall be the dawn. When we come out of our tomb of ignorance and disbelief, how glorious will be the dawn. And so I invite you to take a breath and just pray with me right here. I know that we are in the middle of something right now, the Chrysalis Stage. It's hard to see forward. It's hard to see back. There's parts of us that just simply want life to go back to the way it was. There's parts of us that know that that's simply not possible. And yet we don't know what it looks like going forward. And what I know and hold with compassion and love and light in my heart is that for some, that this time, this in-between time, is far more scarier than it is for others of us. There are many of us who are resting in comfort, sheltering in place with no issue whatsoever, working online, going about our day. And yet there are others who continue to put themselves at risk because they have to, because they must work, because we depend on them, because they are healthcare workers or they're grocery store clerks, or they simply need to pay the bills. And the stimulus check from the government isn't going to make a dent. It is a tender time for humanity. And it is incumbent upon all of us to take not only personal responsibility, but also to examine the sins of the state, the collective society, the inequities that got us here, the fissures along the road that led to this moment. And you and I are asked to daily move into prayer and to hold a vision for a society that is the emergence of that butterfly, the holy shift that is possible for humanity, that is radically different than anything that we have seen heretofore. But it will require people like you and me who can hold space and hold the vision and dream of a world and articulate the vision of justice and peace and wholeness and radical love and compassion and inclusivity and equity at every level. Will you join me in that? Will you break the bread of affliction, the affliction of separation, the affliction of otherness? And will you join in the communion of the eternal Christ consciousness that lives yet again? This is the covenant that has always existed in our hearts. This is the covenant of oneness that has always been, and it is seeking our attention once again. Just as sure as spring bursts into life all around us through the flowers and the trees, so surely again, this consciousness of oneness is begging for our attention, and he is emerging in our collective consciousness here and now. I give thanks for the opportunity to be awake and alive to this moment, to be reborn and resurrected into this commitment to live a life of inclusivity, to live a life of wholeness, to live a life where I know that there is something eternal that exists inside me and exists inside you and it exists inside all of humanity. Let us see it, let us be it, and let us live it, beginning now. And so it is. I wish you peace and blessings on this beautiful Easter morning. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this. We've got Ty Andrews coming up in just a moment. stick around and do me a favor and share this message on Facebook. Spread this live stream around so that the word gets out. Let us continue with the service. I want to bring up at this time, let me see if I can do this, multitasking. Let's bring up our text to give number. If you haven't had an opportunity yet to do that, it's really easy to do with our phone number, 404-800-9467, or you can click on the link that is provided in the chat to give via our webpage. It's through our Breeze system. It really is a breeze, folks, and everything counts. So give generously at this time, and thank you for being a part of a community that's growing and expanding and circulating your good as we tithe and circulate back out into the community around us. Let us say our affirmation together as we do that. All right. I live in a universe of abundance. As I freely and joyfully give, I join in the divine flow, and all that I share with life returns to me multiplied abundantly. And so it is.